All right. Any questions before into the last material before the last test? No. All right. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to finish up chapter 15. Chapter 15 deals with fiscal and monetary policy. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of an introduction to money and monetary policy. Then we're going to talk about a couple of specific kinds of policies. We're going to take a step back and go back to fiscal policy and talk about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, also known as the stimulus. And then we're going to talk about expansionary monetary policy. If you recall from last class, we have these two types of government policy when it comes to trying to stimulate the economy, trying to get out of a recession. And they're split up between fiscal policy, which has to do with taxing and spending power of the government, specifically Congress, the president, tax laws, government spending laws, those sorts of policies. And then we have monetary policy, which has to do with the money and supply, interest rates, etc. And these two different arms of Washington, D.C., kind of the two different ways of stimulating the economy, have some different effects, but we're going to model them somewhat similarly. And the case study I'd like to talk a little bit about is what happened with the Great Recession and the types of policies that we tried to implement in order to get ourselves out of the Great Recession. I'd like to have a little bit of a conversation also about whether or not that even worked, and if so, why, and if not, then why not. So, start off the conversation just with this introduction to money and monetary policy. And I guess a little bit of an introduction to the Fed itself. So first of all, I guess the question I'd like to start off with is just what is money? What is money, Eric?
Something that holds value for you to trade.
Right, so you want to hold value, right? Things that don't hold value would make really bad money, right? So you think like ice would make bad money, right? Except unless maybe you're North Pole or something like that. So one thing you want to hold value, so we call that a store of value. Okay. What else? So the other thing you mentioned was you use it to buy things, so it's a medium of exchange. Okay, so you can use it to buy some stuff. That's a good thing, right? So money has a store of value, medium of exchange, and then there's one last thing that functionally money does, and we define money as being anything that does these three things simultaneously. What is that? Eric?
Universally accepted?
Universally accepted medium of exchange kind of goes, along with that. Right? And this is part of the reason why the problem with the barter system is that double coincidence of wants isn't often around, and so a lot of things aren't universally accepted. It's the one that's probably like the least intuitive. It's just it's a unit of account. And we can denominate things in the units of the money, right? And so if we're going back to colonial days, this may be wampum or beaver pelts or whatever it is that we're going to count as money, something that has some store of value that people will accept in transactions, and we can actually count things by those units. Anything that fulfills these three things counts as money. So historically, of course, Nicholas is in my class where we talk about economic history and such, and so we have lots of examples of different things counted as money. So obviously we have gold, we have shells, we have different kinds of precious metals or whatever else counted as money. Right now, what's our money? What do we call the money that we have now?
Fiat money?
Fiat money, right? So it's not backed by anything. It's money that is money because we say it's money, essentially. So fiat money, it's money because we say so. under other monetary systems, if you had some bills that were produced by the government, then you could take those bills to the bank that would then have to be able to take it to some, the U.S. bank of some sort. We had a couple different U.S. banks before we had our current system, and they would have to exchange that for, whatever it was backed by. If it's backed by gold or if it's backed by silver, you could actually get the equivalent amount in that metal from your money, and it would actually say on the money that's backed by backed by gold or silver, and so you could trade that for silver. Today we can't do that. You take your money to a bank and you ask for gold, you're not going to get any gold, right? So you try to do that? No. So an example of something that has all these characteristics that's a fairly recent innovation is what? What's the biggest innovation in the last 10 years in terms of money?
Credit cards?
Credit cards have been around for a little bit longer. People use them a lot more. Interestingly, credit cards are not actually money. Basically what they're doing is, all they are is short-term loans, right? And loans don't count quite as money.
ATMs.
ATMs are a way of dispensing money from debit accounts generally. I'm just thinking about Bitcoin, right? That Bitcoin serves all these purposes, right? You can use it to buy stuff. You can store stuff as Bitcoin. It may gain value or lose value, but so can currencies, right? If you had any Zimbabwean dollars, 10 years ago, they aren't going to be worth the same today, and it serves as a unit of account. So Bitcoin serves the purpose of money, even if it isn't recognized by a government or anything else. Fiat money, that's money that's recognized by a particular government. Now, of course, lots of controversy right now about money because of changing around the bills. Biggest story in the last week probably had to do with putting
About Tubman replacing Andrew Jackson.
Tubman replacing Jackson.
He was my great-great-grandfather. I had a big issue with that. Just because that's my family heritage, that's my family. We made our way to the top. Don't bring us down.
Well, why they kicked Jefferson to the back while they put the suffragettes on the back of Hamilton. They didn't replace Hamilton's picture. They replaced Jefferson's.
Jackson
because he hated the central bank.
Yeah, Jackson was anti-bank. So it's kind of funny that we ever had him on the most commonly used currency there was. So Harriet, why did I have trouble with her first name? Harriet Tubman, right? Actually makes as much sense as anyone else on a currency, because Jackson made absolutely no sense. I mean, only if you had a state bank.
The
or something
guy
like
in
that.
charge of the money was like, we can't move Hamilton. He fought for central banks. So
I mean, if anyone is going to be on the bill, I'd say Hamilton over even Washington, right? Because he created our monetary, the backbone of our treasury and our monetary system, if nothing else.
Isn't that like federalism?
Yep, that's federalism.
Oh my God, I'm getting educated.
So that's federalism. So what does our central bank look like right now? So what we have is we have the Federal Reserve System. Hamilton fought for a central bank. We had the Bank of the United States starting in the early 1890s. It existed for 15, 20 years, and then it lost its charter. Then we started having monetary problems because we didn't have a central bank. And so even though I want to say it was under Jefferson that they then, no, maybe it was under Madison, that they then, once it lost its charter, then it came back again as the second central bank of the United States, because they realized that we needed a central bank, until Jackson killed the central bank, and we didn't really have a central bank again until the Federal Reserve System. This came about in 1913. The idea behind it was to even out the money supply to be able to control it. And what's unique about the Federal Reserve System that actually takes some credit from Jackson's ideas too, right? It's not just a Hamiltonian's. It's not a central bank, right? This is not the Bundesbank. This is not the Central Bank of England. This is a system. And so what it is actually 12 banks, and each one of them is recognized as part of the system, right? They're not branches of the Fed, they are banks of the Fed. And they're located throughout the United States. And so here's a quick question. Who can name 5 of the locations without making a mistake? 5 of the Feds?
California,
No, the cities.
or cities,
Atlanta, right?
San Francisco,
San Francisco.
Denver.
All right. Nicholas?
New York.
New York. New York's always the important one. It's technically not number 1, but it's actually an important one. New Orleans, no.
Atlanta.
We already got Atlanta.
St. Louis.
St. Louis. Got one? No. We also have Cleveland, Richmond, Chicago, Minneapolis, Dallas, Kansas City, Boston, and Philadelphia. Those are the other ones. So why are they distributed the way they are? Well, it's largely because of our federal system in that we wanted to distribute these things regionally such that they didn't have all the power in one actual central bank. Truly, though, of these 12 banks, the New York one is like the bank of them all. It is the most powerful of the regional Fed banks. There are branches of these Fed banks. So the one in New Orleans actually we have a Fed in New Orleans that's a branch of the Atlanta Fed. There's another one in Jacksonville. There's another one in Miami. Those are all branches of the Atlanta Fed. So, and likewise, there is actually one in Denver, which is a branch of the Minneapolis Fed. But we think about Denver because of the mint, right? We have Treasury Mint, and the Treasury mints the coins, while the Fed actually controls the money supply, how much is actually out there in the banks.
Well, the only reason I said Denver and San Francisco is because for this other paper, I had to learn into their weed regulations and stuff. Come to find out they're both having a problem with learning how to bank money made off of the weed economy. Because it's still federally a crime to grow the plant and make money off the plant. So how do you store money that was made off the plant?
Yeah, because you can get, basically, you'd be treated like a money launderer.
Right.
Yeah, that might be problematic. So what does the Fed do? So the Fed's rules include the following. 1, it's a bank for banks. So what do we use banks for? Store our money there, get loans from there. Guess what? Banks also need those services. When a bank needs to get a loan, or it's a little bit short on how much it's supposed to be holding overnight, it goes to the Fed to borrow from the discount window, and so the Fed plays that role. It's also a central bank. In other words, when someone needs to coordinate monetary policy or decide how much, or basically serve the role of the bank for the United States, right? So we collect, I just sent off a check for taxes last week. When that money goes out, where do they end up depositing it? Well, they deposit it in an account at the Fed because that serves the bank for the U.S. It used to play a role in the centralized check clearing, and it does this still in a digital format. But basically what used to happen is, so let's say if you wrote a check to, so I had an early credit card or a car payment that was going up to somewhere new, some bank up in Detroit, right? So I'd write that check. It would go up to Detroit. They'd deposit at their bank. Then that physical check would go from their bank to the Fed. The Fed would then debit I was in Austin, so it's the Dallas Fed's account by the amount of mine. The Dallas Fed would then debit my bank a certain amount. My bank would then take the money out of my account, right? So that was the check clearing system that actually used to go through the Feds.
Until Leonardo DiCaprio figured it out. The movie Catch Me If You Can.
The main thing is that they still did this check clearing thing, right? So I used to go, I still go on tours of the Atlanta Fed. And there used to be this one room that was just this enormous room. It was probably, starting this side of the bathrooms in LAB, like all the way down, right? And it was just nothing but desks, and there's people like physically clearing checks, right? They were like examining checks and like, sorting them and everything else. And then I'd go back a few years later, and then like half of the room was gone. It was just empty. And then there's like smaller, sphere desks, and then there's like a corner of the room, and then they just got rid of it entirely. And it's all automated now. So it's centralized check clearing. This is a role that the Fed plays as well. And then the final one is to take out or to conduct monetary policy. And its main charge in this is to keep prices stable. If you're keeping prices stable, there's not what?
Inflation.
Inflation, right. It is to prevent inflation. Now, technically, if you're keeping prices stable, there's neither inflation nor deflation. Historically, inflation's been more of a problem than deflation, but it's the same idea, right? Is to control the money supply to keep prices relatively stable. Now, the structure of it is a little bit odd. There are all sorts of conspiracies about the Fed as well. The first thing is that it has a board of governors. That is the entity that's actually in Washington, D.C. The board of governors of the Fed is located in Washington, D.C. The board of governors has a president or a chairman. The chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System is the technical title of currently Janet Yellen. Previous to Janet Yellen, it was Ben Bernanke. Previous to Ben Bernanke, we had Greenspan. These are the folks that run Fed policy. They do it in coordination with other folks as well. And specifically, there is the open market committee of the Fed. On this open market committee, you have the chair of the Fed, again, who's currently Janet Yellen. You have 6 presidents of Fed regional banks. And then you have 6 members of the board. From the Board of Governors. So on this Federal Open Market Committee, you end up with the decision-making power about what's going to happen with monetary policy. Open market operations are what they call the buying and selling of government securities in order to affect the money supply. In ECO 201, if you guys have taken that or you're going to take that, talk a lot more about the details of this. Essentially, the way that it works is that when the Fed buys bonds from banks, it's taking an illiquid asset from them and giving them liquidity. It's giving them cash for a bond, right? When they sell bonds to banks, it's taking something liquid and giving them something illiquid. So buying a bond increases the money supply, selling them a bond decreases the money supply. And that's the main way that we bring about monetary policy. Increasing money supply decreases interest rates, and that's how we end up affecting how much money there is kind of sloshing around the system. It's much more complicated than that, but in the ECO 101 sense, that's all you need to know about open market operations. Questions about this? All right, so let's talk a little bit about, oh, by the way, what is the Fed that's in charge of Atlanta? No, it's not Atlanta, of Mississippi. What Fed region are we in?
Probably Atlanta.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's the closest.
Yeah, we're in Atlanta. If you're from Tupelo or DeSoto County, you're actually in St. Louis. So Mississippi is one of the weird states that's actually split up between two different Fed banks. So we're between Atlanta and St. Louis in the 6th and the 8th. Louisiana is split between Dallas and Atlanta. New Orleans is part of the Atlanta Fed, while Shreveport is part of the Dallas Fed. Then you have some other things like parts of Wisconsin are in the Chicago Fed, some of them are in Minneapolis, etc. So those are the
Is that
Battery
why
things.
they say that like the state of Mississippi is the worst because technically our money's going to two different banks?
No, it's not because of that. It's the poorest because we're stupid. That's the best reason. Yeah. No, actually, the funny thing is that there are some institutions that there are lots of different reasons why we're poor, right? There's a long history to some of the problems with human capital accumulation, and such. But I'd say one of the biggest reasons is the joke about the three biggest cities in Mississippi.
Mm-mm.
What are the three biggest cities in Mississippi?
I have no idea.
Jackson, Gulfport, and I don't know.
Karachi?
Probably not.
How
Probably like Natchez.
Mobile, New Orleans, and Memphis, right? Because nothing else is really a city in this state, right? Jackson's not a real city.
We haven't claimed Memphis as part of the state since
I'd say
like
Jackson,
year
8 or 9
1917.
cities.
What's that? Jackson's 8 or 9 cities? I don't even think it's a real city. I mean, that's the thing.
You have Brandon, Star.
Yeah. And there's
And
like,
I know where those are at.
It's just like there's a bunch of cities that just happen to meet up at that point.
And that just happens to become Jackson. Yeah. It's just one big suburb. Yeah, that's how it feels. It feels like one big suburb without a core of a city actually attached to it.
yeah.
When you look at like where wealth is, like in, I don't know if I've mentioned this in this class or the other class, but like if you go through like poor parts of Georgia, they're just as poor as poor parts of Mississippi. The difference is that Georgia has Atlanta. We don't have an Atlanta. We don't have anything like that to drive economic growth, to bring in new industries, to draw in human capital and everything else, right? And think about our location of our universities. They're away from the capital, so you don't have that connection between like industry, government, and human capital development, right? Everything is just kind of dispersed. So people graduate from Ole Miss, people graduate from Mississippi State, people graduate from Southern. They get jobs. If they get good jobs, they'll get jobs in Houston, they'll get jobs in New Orleans and Memphis, wherever it is. They won't get jobs in the state because we just don't have the cities to attract the human capital and keep it. Then there's a long history as to why that might be the case. Yeah. So that's my short answer to a very complicated question. So let's talk about some specific policies. And the first one that I'd like to talk about is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009.
Who's in charge of naming these?
I know, isn't it great? It's like, and I was listening to some podcast the other day about Obamacare, and of course that's the Affordable Care Act. But there's another law that was, I think Affordable Care Act might have been the Senate version. There's a House version that was also competing. And it's like they eventually worked out a compromise, but somehow they decided to take one name rather than the other name, and it's like it's odd. It's like, yeah, it tells you a little bit more about it with the Affordable Care Act, but it's also, the Affordable Care and Patient Protection Act tells you a little bit about it, but it's also just kind of arbitrary, right? Basically, the authors of the bill, I think, get to choose, and then it gets worked out in committee sometime. Okay, so what was this? This is also known as the stimulus, right? So when people, talk about what was the effect of the Obama stimulus, this is the law that they're talking about. Couple different things of what its purpose was. One was to maintain and increase employment. It came about towards the end of the technical recession. So the recession, the Great Recession, if we wanted to put a date on it, went from, I want to say November 2007, it was late 2007, it might have been December, until March of 2009. Technically, by the time this law came about, we were already out of recession. We didn't know about it until like November, right? We didn't know. You don't really date a recession until well after you're actually out of it, because you have to collect all the data, you have to look at the numbers, say, is the economy growing, is it not growing, what's happening with employment, et cetera. But the Great Recession started in late 2007, lasted about 18 months into March 2009. But it's very hard to tell whether or not you're out of recession. And even when we got out of this recession, we still weren't really producing jobs. And so the idea was we're going to try to create jobs through this stimulus, right? The other thing is that it was trying to actually create some investments in infrastructure. In other words, roads, bridges, ports, etc. Also trying to invest in health and environmental protection. These are some of the explicit goals of this. I'm not saying that it necessarily did any of these things, but this was the idea, right? This was the motivation behind it. And then the final thing, and this is one of the things that I think is most important about what the recovery was, what the stimulus was trying to do, was to stabilize state and local budgets. So these were the stated goals of the stimulus. And one of the things I'd like to talk a little bit about is to what degree did it actually do these things, right? Was it successful in them? And we can look at some data to talk about that. But the other thing to think about is, what did it actually contain in terms of spending versus tax cuts and everything else? And, what is the myth versus reality of all this? Because you'll hear people talk about the stimulus as if it's just a boondoggle, right? We just blew all this money, gave away all this stuff. But when you actually break it down and look what the actual allocations were for, it's a little bit more difficult to say that it's just like a big spending spree. One of the big things about it was that about a third of it was this right here. So what happened was that, what happens to tax revenue? Where does the state of Mississippi get its taxes?
Property tax.
Property tax partially. State income tax, right? What else? Where else do you, sales taxes, right? All those things are taxes that go to the state. Once people lose jobs, they're also going to be losing their income, right? If their property taxes, what happens to the value of a home? If it falls, what happens to the amount of property tax? It falls as well. All these things, retail, are people buying as much stuff? Are they buying as many TVs and everything else when they lose their job? No. All those things that affect state budgets fell, right? And so states were going through this massive shortfall, and unlike the federal government, what can states not do?
Print their own money.
They can't print their own money, that's right. What else can they not do? Most states cannot do what? We can't run a budget deficit, right? We can run a deficit for a year, but we can't accumulate debt. If we run a deficit, it has to be pulled out of our rainy day fund, right? And so when all this stuff started hitting the revenue side of the states, they were going to say, oh, wait a second, the only way we can balance our budget is to start cutting. What's the number one category for state spending in Mississippi? What do we spend more money on than anything else? Schools, yeah, education, right? K through 12 and higher ed. And so a lot of this, when they're looking at cutting, they're going to start firing teachers, right? They're going to cut back on local budgets and how much they're going to be allocated from the state. And so the federal government said, wait a second, we're going to step in and we're going to have to plug some of these gaps in your budget. And that was about a third of the overall stimulus, was just plugging those gaps. Okay, so, and this, going back to our, I'm referring to the economic history class. Think about like Hamilton, about how like Hamilton had the idea when he was the Treasury Secretary of taking over the state debts from the Revolutionary War, because the states had debts in addition to the federal debts, and they appropriated all those state debts. And that was one of his big moves. It's mostly a power play to get more power in the federal government, but it kind of harkens back to this, which is like, guess what? We're the feds. We can step in and help you out when you need to, even though the states run their own budgets. So what was contained in that, first of all, let's see. So what was the stimulus? Well, basically, we can break it down to three pieces. The first piece was just spending. This was extending unemployment benefits. We had, that cost about $80 billion. We had infrastructure investment. That was about $100 billion. We had healthcare. That's about $150 billion. So all that ends up adding up, right? Then we had state budget support. So we had about $60 billion that went directly to fund ed, just in terms of budgetary relief. We had probably another 20 to 30 billion that was Medicaid support for that, because of course that's our government policy for our government program to provide health insurance for poor people. What happens when we go through a recession? There are more poor people go on to Medicaid rolls. States were having trouble meeting their balancing the budget because of more people on Medicaid. So all of these things add up in terms of state budgets and spending, and the total amount between these two is about $550 billion. Because I just listed a few of these, but there's lots of different, there's environmental spending, there's all sorts of little line items, lots of different programs that got some sort of benefit. So that was about $550 billion spending when you count both state budget support and kind of new spending.
This is the second bailout. Sounds like car industry.
So this isn't the bailout, this is the stimulus.
Right.
So there were two bailouts, plus there was the stimulus,
Right.
right? So the bailouts went to the banks and the car industry, but this was just stimulating the economy through increased government spending and tax cuts, right? So it wasn't directed towards private entities at all, right? So the infrastructure investment was like, I don't know if you guys remember, but you would see like the, Cloverleaf, that intersection at 49 and Broadway, right down here by the Walmart, right? So all those like shrubs and stuff that were put in, and they did some like improvements on the access to that, that was all ARRA money, right? So they would put up these big signs and say, workers here, and they would have like a really detailed list of like, this money was part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, da 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 da, and like it would be like fine print. You'd have to read it as you're driving by on the big orange signs. They'd actually say that this was stimulus money as they're spending it. So
Now, do the people have a right to know like exactly how everything is spent by the feds, or
yeah,
is that like their own? Okay.
yeah. So all that stuff is available, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So that's all in the bills, and then you get whenever there's like a procurement contract, because of course you can say, oh, the state is spending on infrastructure investment, but Warren Paving, for example, might get a contract from MDOT that is the subcontractor to, is actually the one who applied for the money to the feds and that's where the money actually goes. So, and all that stuff is public record. Tax cuts were about $275 billion.
This is still under ARA.
Yeah, so this is the third part of it, right? So we had new spending, we had supporting state budgets, and then we have tax cuts. So we had things like the child tax credit was extended. We have a relaxation of the AMT, which is the alternative minimum tax. This is a fairly arcane part of the budget, which is or part of our taxing system, which is that back in the 1970s, we wrote these rules that said, well, if you earn more than this much money and you pay less than this much in tax, you may be subject to this alternative minimum tax, which meant that 1040 and 1040A and everything else you just filled out is irrelevant, right? You have to pay this other tax rate because you basically have too many deductions for the amount of money that you earn. And so that ceiling on the AMT increases only by legislative act, right? So it was set back in the 1970s before we had all that inflation in 1978, 79, and so it's actually pretty low. And so like for a single earner, it's like 125 or something like that, which you think, oh, that's not a small amount, but there are a lot of people that earn 125 that shouldn't be like put out of the, like in a completely different tax system than everybody else. You also had, the biggest chunk of this was lowering the withholding amount. So the key thing, and this was about 140 billion, was that payroll deduction, that FICA, withholding should be 2 H's, I don't know. That FICA coming out of your paycheck, they reduced that by 2 percentage points during this period, during the stimulus. And it didn't, the goal was to not negatively affect people's expectations in terms of Social Security and everything else, but they just took out less of everyone's paycheck. So everyone got a little bit of a tax cut. You didn't have to apply, you didn't have to do any special forms, you didn't have to wait for a check in the mail like you had to in 2001, 2003 with Bush tax cuts. It just kind of came in the mail, right? It didn't even come in the mail. It just, you had more money in your paycheck every single month. So it was just a stimulus directly into that. So overall, while a lot of more conservative commentators will say that, that it was this, massive increase in the size of government and everything else, it was as much, a tax cut and helping out state budgets as it was anything else. Now the question though becomes, how does that affect the economy? So for this, we can go back to our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which I'll just abbreviate ADAS. Remember on the y-axis, we have our measure of prices, which is the index value for the overall level of prices, which the one that we most commonly talk about with the inflation rate is the CPI, right? That's what we talk about with our measure of a price level is the consumer price index. Our measure of output in the macroeconomy is just the real gross domestic product, or real GDP, the value of all goods and services produced in the economy when controlling for inflation. Those are that's our price and quantity measures. Then we have, of course, our aggregate demand curve, which is downward sloping. So aggregate demand is just the demand for all the goods and services in the economy. And we can have our aggregate supply curve, which is just going to be upward sloping, which represents the production in the economy at different price levels that it's going to be increasing as well. So, just focusing on one aspect of the stimulus, what's going to happen when the government cuts taxes by making everyone, not take quite as much out of their paycheck and send them home with a little bit of extra money every month.
Aggregate demand shifts right.
Aggregate demand should shift to the right. It should increase because now what's going to end up increasing?
Demand.
Demand, but
Well,
whose demand?
Consumer.
Consumer demand, right? So consumers are going to want to use that money to buy more stuff, and so aggregate demand should shift to the right. And so we get a new aggregate demand curve to AD prime, which represents higher level of consumption. So higher consumer expenditures or higher level of consumption, because now disposable income is higher. If you have higher disposable income, you want to spend more out of that disposable income, so you're going to demand more goods and services. So that would have the effect of increasing real GDP. So we'd go from Y1 to Y2, so an increase in real GDP. And we would have the effect of going from P1 to P2, which would also increase the price level or cause inflation. So the result in a cut from a cut in taxes is to increase consumption, therefore increasing aggregate demand, which would increase GDP, increase the price level, and decrease unemployment, as higher levels of GDP are associated with lower levels of unemployment. Now, the question is, did this actually happen? So after 2009, we implemented this, tax cuts, government spending increase. By the way, government spending increase should also do the exact same thing, so you can just focus on one, but that works through G rather than C. It works through just directly through government spending. Did this actually happen?
No.
Why not?
Consumer sentiments were bad.
Because, well, yeah, inflation, prices going up and stuff.
Did prices go up?
Mm-hmm.
No, we really didn't have much inflation in 2009, 2010, 2011. Right? Those were years that the CPI increase was so low that the COLA adjustments in Social Security taxes in Social Security payments didn't go up. Right? So it was basically years of zero inflation. So we didn't get inflation. Did the economy grow from 2009 to 2010? It grew a little. Unemployment decreased a little, but not very much, not considering the size of the stimulus. Think about it. If the size of the stimulus is, let's just say, $800 billion, the economy is, $16 trillion at the time, right? So $800 billion, that's, a 5% increase in overall spending. Seems like it should be a big deal, right? It should stimulate the economy somewhat. What's interesting is that we really didn't get much of an effect from this. Now, it's hard to tell because, for all we know, that aggregate demand would have shifted even further to the left, because what you have to remember is that during the Great Recession, it shifted to the left, right? We had lower consumption, we had lower business expenditures, we ended up net exports probably increased a little bit because we decreased imports by so much, but we had a fairly strong shift to the left in aggregate demand during the Great Recession. So maybe what this is just kind of fought against the tide a little bit and got us back to where we were and didn't allow it to decrease anymore. But I like Nicholas's answer, which is dealing with consumer sentiments, right? Because consumption isn't just based upon disposable income. It also depends upon how do you feel about the future. So if you feel great about your future job prospects, what are you more likely to do?
Go blow up cash.
Go spend some money. You're going to make tons of money next year, so why not spend some today? You'll have a credit card, you can just run up some credit card debt and that'd be fine. Well, lots of things were going on this time. One of the big things that was going on, so I don't know if you guys remember this, but credit got incredibly tight, right? I had I don't even want to say how many credit cards I had. You know, some of them didn't have any balances on them. But every single month, it seemed like for about 6 months to a year, I got a new statement from my credit card company saying, guess what? We know we talked to you about this interest rate of being, let's say, 12% or 8% or 10% or whatever it was. But really, we're kind of having some hard times because banks are failing, so maybe your interest rate is actually going to be 16% or 18% or 20%. Now, this will only apply if you don't close your account and you want to use your card for future purchases. If you agree not to use your card in the future at all, you can keep your old interest rate. But if you do agree to this, then we use it, we count that even on the existing balances. How's that going to affect aggregate demand? If people are getting these notices in the mail that all of a sudden your interest rates are being jacked up, right? Consumer sentiments were really crappy. No one's going to want to go out and make more purchases. No one's going to feel great about it. Well, that same thing was happening with home construction. Home construction fell through the floor, partially because the standards on loans got so tight at the time, right? So for a while they were giving loans to everybody. Then in 2008, 2009, 2010, they started giving the loans to nobody, right? And so that's going to decrease aggregate demand too. So it's fighting against a lot of kind of headwinds in the economy. So it's hard to say that it didn't. It's hard to say that it didn't have any effect. But you had this weird thing where it just didn't show up in the data if it did. It's hard to tell what it would have been like without it. Now, let's talk a little bit about monetary policy. Now, at the time, we had a monetary policy that was accommodating. In other words, we were increasing government spending and we were decreasing taxes, and at the same time, we were decreasing interest rates in order to try to stimulate the economy. The problem is that the Fed can try to decrease interest rates, but that doesn't mean that the banks are going to charge you lower interest rates on your mortgage or on your credit cards or anything like that. So now what we're doing is we're going away from that period of decreasing interest rates, and we've actually started increasing interest rates again. So this is going to be an example of contractionary monetary policy. So if the Fed decides to increase interest rates, which they started doing in, was it December? Yeah, December for the first time since 2007, 2008. First time, in almost 10 years that they decided to increase interest rates. How is that going to end up affecting the economy? Well, again, we'll have our aggregate supply curve. Of our aggregate demand curve. And now the policy change is going to be an increase in the interest rate. Which curve is going to shift and why? And which way is it going to shift? Aggregate supply isn't going to shift again, which is kind of like silly because we never have aggregate supply shifting yet, right? We'll talk a little bit about one example where that might happen when we talk about deficits and debt and taxes a little bit more in chapter 16. But again, aggregate supply is not going to be moving here. It's going to be aggregate demand, and it's going to shift which way? To the left or to the right?
Left.
To the left, right? Left, correct. Aggregate demand ends up shifting to the left with an increase in the interest rates. Increase in interest rates means that, think about it in your own credit cards. Big ticket items like washing machines, cars, consumer durables. I've for the last couple of years, I've had my eyes on one of those outbuildings, like a little shed to put in my backyard. Right? I generally don't have enough cash for like even a $600 or $800 shed, but I'd love one of those sheds. So I'd probably want to put that on a credit card. If I'm being charged 20% because the Fed increased interest rates, which again, banks and the Fed, there's a connection there, but sometimes it's not that tight. But oftentimes, by the way, you'll see your credit card statements and it'll say, this much plus prime, right? The prime is tied to the interest rates that the Fed sets. So even though the credit card company determines whether or not you're going to have an 18% or 19%, if the Fed increases interest rates, then guess what? Your credit card interest rate is also going to increase because usually your credit card is tied to the prime rate, which is tied to the Fed interest rates. So aggregate demand is going to decrease because now it's harder to borrow money if a company wants to build a new factory or buy new machines. Consumers are going to have a harder time paying off their credit card debt, so they're not going to be accumulating more loans to go get washing machines, etc. And so that's going to cause aggregate demand to shift to the left. Now, what should happen to GDP then with this new policy of decreasing aggregate demand through increasing interest rates? Well, we're going to get a leftward shift we're going to get a lower level of real GDP, which means that we're going to get a decrease in growth, and we're going to get a lower price level as well, which means a decrease in inflation, or if we wanted to take this literally, it would be a deflation because the CPI would get lower. Generally, we think about this model telling us something about disinflation and inflation rather than inflation, deflation, but it all works out in kind of the same direction. Now, why would you do this? This looks bad, right? We decreased GDP. But what else did we do? We decreased the price level, and so if the Fed is worried about inflation, that they're likely to increase interest rates, tighten up credit in order to make sure that the economy doesn't get into an inflationary pattern. In the 1960s and 70s, we had a very freewheeling fiscal policy that often ran deficits because that aggregate demand was shifting to the right. We also had some shocks. Remember, the aggregate supply curve is going to be tied somewhat to resource prices. What happened to oil prices in the 1970s?
Went up.
Went up very dramatically. That's going to shift our aggregate supply curve to the left. Because of that, we had both a decrease in aggregate demand and a decrease in aggregate supply, but the aggregate supply shift was actually more. So we got this situation where we had an increase in the price level and a decrease in GDP. What's that referred to as? Stagflation. So the stagnating economy plus inflation is what we experienced in the 1970s. Now, the problem is that everyone was expecting more and more inflation because the fiscal policy was trying to accommodate this by shifting aggregate demand more to the right. Eventually, what happened is that Paul Volcker and the Fed had to come in and just put the hammer down, raise interest rates really dramatically, and when they did so, immediately people's expectations were like, oh, wait a second, there's not going to be inflation? Okay, now I understand, and they stopped spending almost immediately. So if you look at what happened to inflation rates, as soon as Volcker started his tightening policy, it was like within a month and a half, 2 months, that all of a sudden inflation rates started coming down, and we went from a situation where we had inflation, and stagnating economy to one where we at least stabilized prices and then we started growing again in 1983, 84. So, all right, questions about fiscal or monetary policy? All right, good luck on the test. I will be here on Thursday at 3:50. If you want to take the test here, I'll proctor it for you then. Try to be here on time. The test shouldn't take that long, but if people show up at like 4:15 or 4:20, it's going to be really annoying. So, because most people tend to finish the test in 20, 30 minutes anyway. So, all right. See you guys then.